come up appearing on these panels because I've just shifted the panelist presentation so it doesn't look like we have the Americans versus the Russians. We're just all integrated here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Clemons. I've had the privilege of moderating here for 9 years, and I want to thank Eftesan Ketbi and her team for inviting us and always sort of committing to doing some panels that are very edgy, and I think this one will deliver with that. I'm editor-at-large of a new publication called Semafor. Some of you have been reading it and coming up to me, and all I would say, and I look at my friends Ed Luce and others, and sorry for the promotion here, but sign up for it, then you'll get my email, and then please send me all of the scoops on politics from your countries. That's how a global publication grows, so I look forward to that in interacting with all of you. Well, look, our title today is The Russian War in Ukraine, Rewriting the World's New Rules. And I'm going to basically say that rewriting the world's new rules sounds too polite for the conversation we're about to have. Things are much more raw right now, much more strained and stressed. I don't know if we're blasting through the new rules, blasting through the old rules, but this is not the kind of polite conversation or polite sets of issues. We'll have a polite conversation, but the issues are very tough, very edgy. Tens of thousands of people are dying. This is a consequential time in global history. This is not a panel that is dealing with trivial issues. This is a big, big panel here. And we have an extraordinary group here with us. And it's not often that you see this kind of panel in today's world. We have just to my left Dr. Andrey Kortunov, who's the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. For those of you who may be familiar with Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations, I recently told Richard that he was the Andrey Kortunov of America. That's a joke. We have Cliff Kupchan, who is the chairman of the Eurasia group. It's great to be here with Cliff. And we have, of course, Dr. Sergey Karaganov, the scientific head of the School of International Economics and Foreign Affairs, National Research University, and honorary chair of the Presidium of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, Moscow. I've had the privilege of interviewing both Dr. Karaganov and Cliff and Dr. Kortunov in the past. So as we start this discussion about not just Ukraine, it's really a conversation far beyond that, but really is to the degree that we're seeing a change in the way the world operates. Whether we're thinking of it as a, moving into some form of multipolar world, what we are transitioning to, what the big tectonic plates of power are, and the different dimensions of power, who the winners and losers in this evolution are going to be. I've asked Dr. Kortunov to help set the stage in just a few minutes. No long speeches, guys. I'll cut you off. And then we will have time for conversation and Q&A with our audience. So, Andrey, if you wouldn't mind helping to set the stage for how you see this, not only from Moscow's viewpoint, but I ask any panelist to try to not only share with us your own views, but also give a little objective distance to think analytically. So we don't have just Russians and Americans up here. We have people who are looking with some objectivity of how this system is going to work without wearing flags on our forehead. But you go ahead. Andrey?
Well, thank you, Steve. As a good moderator, you should be looking for a drama here.
Don't worry, I know we'll get it.
And it's easy to be alarmist and pessimistic. It's the flavor of the season. And all of us are entertaining escalation scenarios. All of us are playing with various models of how the world order is going to implode, to collapse, and what will happen tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, next year. But just to keep up the discussion, let me try to use a couple of minutes, and I will try not to abuse the schedule, to make a modest case for optimism, as odd as it might sound.
This is why I've got Cliff here, because Cliff is never optimistic.
But let me try to state a couple of ideas and let Cliff and Sergey criticize me for being too naive.
Yeah.
And let me start with the following. If I were to use just one word to describe the essence of the current crisis and the implications of the current crisis, the word would be resilience. And I would add that this is resilience that most of us failed to foresee. We can clearly talk about the resilience of the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian society resisting the Russian military operation on its territory. We can also talk about the resilience of the Russian economic system and to some extent the Russian political system, which continued to operate rather smoothly under an increasing pressure, political and economic pressure from the West. We can talk about the resilience of the West itself, which maintained the cohesion when the costs of its pressure on Russia started to grow, again, both political and economic costs. And finally, we can talk about the resilience of the Global South in its intention not to get directly involved into this conflict. So if this is true, if we have a combination of resiliences, I think it would be fair to say that the international system at large has also demonstrated and continues to demonstrate a degree of resilience. Of course, many bad things can still happen. We can still have a nuclear escalation, we can still have an implosion of the international system, but just a couple of most recent developments, which I think support my point. The US-Russia negotiations on nuclear weapons are underway, and we will see negotiations on the future of the START agreement in Cairo. President Biden meets Chairman Xi in Indonesia, and I think that the dangers of a direct military clash between China and the United States over Taiwan are very low. The oil prices remain very volatile, but they are not more volatile than they were, let's say, 10 years ago. I don't think that we are approaching a moment when we have a serious resource crunch or a major food crisis in the world. So basically, the system survived. For the time being, we can argue that the system turned out to be more stable and turned out to be more resilient and resistant to shocks than many thought. And let me remind you that 3 years ago, I do recall here in this particular room, we discussed how the COVID pandemic would impact the international system, and there were many, gloom and doom scenarios that the world would never be the same, that we are entering an entirely different period. Now, 3 years later, who actually remembers these predictions and these doomsday scenarios? The same can be applied to the region, and I don't think I have now time to talk about the changes in the region, but I hope that we will have this opportunity later over this discussion. But my take is that though it becomes much more difficult for great powers to collaborate on specific issues related to Middle East, it is still not impossible. For instance, just one example, we have this United Nations Security Council resolution on the trans-border humanitarian assistance to Syria. Right. This resolution was extended a couple of times, and now it expires in January. My bet is that despite all the difficulties, despite all the problems, this resolution is likely to be extended again, because all the sides are interested in that, and all the sides might have the political will to do that. Yes, there will be complications. Regional powers are getting more assertive. That might contain certain risks, but I do not believe that we will have anything like a big-scale Iranian-Saudi war. I don't think it is approaching. So let me just finish this very brief statement with saying that when we listen to the sounds of the crisis, we usually take these sounds as the roar of the trumpets of the apocalypse. But I think it is just a ring of the alarm clock.
Right.
It's time to wake up.
Well, thank you for that. And Cliff, let me bring you in here. And in doing this and sharing the elements of the dashboard you think are important to surface right now, what I'm hearing from Andrey Kortunov is that the situation with Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, this moment, which we're going to get to Dr. Karaganov, is defined as he's defined it as an existential moment for Russia. The West has sort of seen it as a rallying cry. I've interviewed Andrey before, who said, essentially this is a fight between Russia and the West with the platform of Ukraine. And so, but what I'm hearing from you now is it may not be as dire from a global tectonic perspective as often discussed. And Cliff Kupchan, I'm wondering how you see it.
Well, I'm going to zoom back in, and no, I'm not as optimistic as Andrey. Well, let me start by summarizing the view of Washington and then briefly saying what I think of that view. I mean, look, in Washington, people are really optimistic right now. The prevailing view is that the Ukrainians can win this war with U.S. help, will win this war, and should try to win this war. The Ukrainians should press the military advantage. Russians are, maybe regrouping in the east, but troubled everywhere. It may be possible to gain more land before winter sets in, and that's the view in Washington. I can tell you, because I've been in these meetings, it is a very, very self-confident view. The view is that for the next year at least, U.S. political support and European political support for the war will be there. And I have to say that the recent midterm election, I think, will make President Biden, will give him wind at the back. It was an amazing election in my country, from my view anyway. It was one that was regenerating, and one where I think President Trump got a real blow. The American system got a real kick, very unexpectedly. The logic of the American view, the self-confidence, given Ukrainian wins, given what I should also mention, this U.S. policy of I call it salami tactic escalation. More sophisticated weapons to Ukraine by piece, up to HIMARS, a little further. The view is that Putin is deterred, that he's scared of a war against NATO. So all in all, the logic in D.C. makes sense. It's also extremely dangerous, in my view, in a couple senses. First, we don't really care, but we certainly don't know what the Russian red lines are. And, might have thought we already stepped on them, but they're probably somewhere. And I, for one, don't want to know what a desperate President Putin is going to do with chemical and or nuclear weapons. I think that's extremely, extremely worrisome. Secondly, the beginnings of the political winds, I think, are changing. The far right of the Republican Party, Marco Rubio, even Speaker McCarthy, not the far right. The Progressive Caucus issued a kind of peace now, but then retracted the letter. Most interestingly, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, has said it may be time to talk. So, I think in the end of my comments here that, Steve has gotten to this, some in the introduction to the piece. We sometimes forget that tens of thousands of young kids, teenagers, have died already. Since this conference began this morning, another couple hundred kids have probably died. Winter's coming on. There's going to be a natural pause. I think given the constellation of events, this growing minority view, growing forceful minority view, has a chance in my country. And the final thing is, if the Russians are willing to talk about the status of the occupied territories or the annexed territories, then I think the Americans and the Ukrainians could offer no NATO for Ukraine. You got the basis of something to talk about. Then I would begin to become more optimistic, like my friend Andrey. I've always wanted to be optimistic like him, and I will try to get there if it goes in that direction.
How do you, just real quickly before I jump to Sergey on that, how do you not get characterized immediately for that view of being an appeaser, a Neville Chamberlain, an accommodationist, Russian expansion, the first kind of invasion of a sovereign country of this sort from U.S. perspective since the end of World War II. So,
because the thrust of my idea, and those think like me, would insist that Russia return to the pre-invasion borders, so that under the plan that I just put forward, very, the sketchiest of sketchiness.
Do you start the invasion in 2014 or this year?
The invasion, the pre-February borders, the 2014 borders. Any deal that gave Russia land is not sellable in the United States.
Right.
So I don't think they're not going to be a better offer than what I just tried to sketch out.
So Sergey Karaganov, Zbigniew Brzezinski once told me in an interview that there are certain challenges that happen for a country that are defining ones and certain ones that are not, and how that nation behaves. In the case when he was talking about the United States, you can have a challenge that becomes a defining one, meaning winning or losing becomes an existential moment because it matters so much more beyond the crisis. And you've essentially argued that about the Ukraine war now, that Russia cannot lose, and that what is at place right now is Russia's place in the future, a civilization of civilizations, along, let me see what you said, a long legacy of heroes, et cetera, that have fought these wars. And you sort of see this as the next existential moment. And I'd love to get your dashboard of how you look at the conflict now. And let me just ask you this. Do you think, and I mean this seriously, from your perspective, do you see Vladimir Putin and Russia winning on any dimension right now of conflict? Because when there's this old game that we would play in the United States called Risk, it was a board game. And you would somehow take a move and it could be disastrous, or you would do other moves and find. And I'm just trying to understand Vladimir Putin's incentives for taking the actions that he did, and whether you think Russia is winning on any dimension of this conflict.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Of course, we read newspapers, and newspapers lie by 95+% or above. So don't trust them. I'll give you my reading of the whole thing. There are 3 levels of the conflict. The lower level, the tactical one, is Ukraine. The aim there was to stop NATO expansion, to crush Ukrainian, crush Ukrainian statehood, half done, demilitarize, half done. So there will be ups and downs with onslaughts, retreats for a few years. Now, hopefully, the whole thing will not end with going to a higher level of violence, which is possible, but at this juncture, not likely. But it is a very small part of the picture, even from my point of view. The bigger part of the picture is what Russia achieves, and here I think we are winning by the real goals. One is to restructure Russian elite, to wipe away pro-Western elements and comprador bourgeoisie. Done. We invited our Western colleagues to do the job for us. Done. We are united, strong, and we are ready. Second, prepare Russia economically, morally, for life for 15 years, hopefully less, in a very intensively challenging environment. Wars will be everywhere. So we have to restructure economy, we have to rearm our armed forces to put the economy on more or less war footing, because for 10 years at least, there will be a very rapid change in the world, which will provide for dozens of conflicts. So we are creating kind of a fortress Russia, with some ups and downs, but relatively successfully. Saying that, I mean, there is a third.
I mean, just real quick, what are the ups?
Sorry?
What are the ups? You said some ups and downs. I'm just interested in what the ups are.
Upstart, I don't understand.
The ups. You said with we
Oh,
have
no,
some
no. I
ups
mean,
and
the
downs.
economy and the society and the elite is being rapidly restructured. And here, I mean, there's no fifth column, there's everything. I mean, they were, and without repression or cultural revolution, which is good, because they were simply let away, or else, I mean, had to disappear. The economy is being put on more or less war footing, on a footing which is more prepared for long-term, I mean, rivalry and, if not worse. So these are the main aims. And there is a third level, which I think is also, we're doing relatively well, and that is undermining. We came to a conclusion that there is no way we could come to agreement with the West. So, I mean, the aim is to undermine finally its position. We invited our Western colleagues to do their job for us. They're doing away with globalism, they're doing away with free trade, they're doing away with democracy, with everything they were born and on which they built power. And what is happening is that the world majority, because of Russia's actions in its own interest, is rising just before our eyes. And here, Dr. Abesam is showing us here, this Abu Dhabi is becoming Stockholm, Geneva, and Helsinki at the same time. But it's not only Abu Dhabi. It's everywhere. So we are rapidifying the change of power in the world. And eventually, after 10 to 15 years, hopefully, if we avoid, I mean, something calamitous, we will be much better off in a very different world. So it's not about Ukraine, with all my respect to my friends. Ukraine is a tactical, very important issue with a lot of losses, with ugly war, etc., etc. But it is about long-term direction of the world, politics, economics, moral dimensions, and of the role of Russia within that world.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things I've been trying to think about, we see the 9th anniversary of this conference here in Abu Dhabi and the Emirates Policy Center. I'm trying to think about what happens 15 years from now. So the 24th anniversary of this conference. Will power look like it largely does today? Will the system be resilient in the ways, Andrey, you just said? And as I think about it, my general take is I see, and I know this is controversial, and my friend Jacob Heilbrunn of National Interests out here sees it differently, so I want to tip my hat to him, but I see America in a kind of relative strategic contraction from various roles that it played in the world. And when I listen to Dr. Gargash speak today about vacuums and those that would fill them, part of the perception of that contraction, in my view, is leaving vacuums. And I don't think other parties, be they China or other, are necessarily ready to run into them. But it's in one element of the international system. I think the other element that's very interesting is when you look at Russia's behavior recently, and my personal view is, I wouldn't find this sort of a net win for Russia on many levels, and it may make it more quickly irrelevant in the future. And then when you look then at the great power rivalries, isn't this moment, Andrey Kortunov, really playing into an ascendance track for China to matter much more, to speed up, if you will, China's importance and relevance in global governance and in key global issues? How do you see China amidst these questions we're talking about? And to some degree, this is a bit narcissistic because we're talking about Russia and the U.S. But what are the other powers? India, the MENA region, other powers that matter in the future?
Well, speaking of China, I think that China has already expressed its intention to demonstrate prudence in this particular crisis. And this is not accidental because China has profited more than any other country from the existing global order.
Right.
So why should they disrupt this global order if it served them so well? I think China will be a game taker, not a game maker, in the relations with the United States. And it's up to Washington, D.C. to decide what kind of relationship the United States wants to have with China, if indeed China is treated as an equal partner to the United States. That might definitely define the Chinese behavior. But if we are talking about the anniversary of this forum in, let's say, mid-2030s or closer to the middle of the century, my take is that the real problem of the world will not be a problem between Russia and the United States or between the West and China. It will be the problem between the global North and the global South. Because this problem is really fundamental. And I'm not talking about a country like Abu Dhabi right now. I'm talking about countries in Africa and in South Asia. I think that the world will basically struggle with the problem of a very major relocation of resources from the north of the south to the south. And it's not clear how this problem can be managed or even mitigated.
Let me ask you a quick question before I jump to Sergey. Does Russia leadership or do the Russian people look at China as a small power or as a power that is on par with them or a power that is greater than they are?
I think it depends on a particular dimension of power. Of course,
I mean, just take China in its totality.
Well, I think that Russians might take pride in the fact that Russia remains a nuclear superpower, which China is not. Definitely militarily, China is advancing quite fast, but Russia arguably has power projection capabilities which China does not possess, though it's questionable. But economically, definitely China is by far superior to Russia, and this relationship will continue to be asymmetrical. And with the current developments, these asymmetries might grow in future, that's clear. That should be a matter of concern, but so far as President Putin and Chairman Xi relationship is concerned, I think both leaders will do what is needed to avoid a crisis in the relationship, because both invested strategically in this relationship so much that they wouldn't jeopardize it by any unfriendly rhetoric or any manifestation of asymmetries.
Sergey, in 15 years from now, on the 24th anniversary of this conference, who are the big players on the global chessboard?
Well, I mean, I'll be too old or dead, so I mean, so I could risk now.
I expect you to live forever.
First, United States will contract, but will be still a player. China, of course, will become the #1 player in the world, all the more, and #1. Russia, if it survives this crisis, would be one of the great power brokers. Europe will disappear completely. Well, of course, hopefully, I mean, we love Europe, we love European culture.
I mean, you said that Russia will be the most important balancer of the North. Right?
No, we will be power broker. But the main thing which will happen is not the South. It is not that we call world majority, and that is non-West, will be completely on the rise. And countries here, countries like Indonesia, India, Arab states, especially of the person called some Africans, will be deciding new rules. That because now we are living without any rules. By the way, we are living in the rules of jungle, which were imposed, I'm sorry, by our Western partners over the last 15, 20 years.
And so you believe they will be important?
They will. I mean, these countries will be deciding because, and I hope that they will fill the vacuum. China, because of its cultural peculiarity, couldn't take over in next 15 years. Maybe in 100, everybody would talk Chinese. And would have talked in Chinese if they still very strangely wouldn't have eliminated their fleet, which was, I mean, 10 times more than any fleet in the world in the 15th century, if I am correct. So maybe in 100 years, but in the coming 15 years, it will be a very balanced system. I like it. Russia will, of course, be not a serious player, but it will be a power broker. because it will be northern Eurasian power and a power broker within the non-Western system, which we call global majority. Thanks God, what has happened during the last 15 years, and especially during now, we have turned east from the west. I'm proud to be the author of the idea, because I invited Ords to defend us from Teutons. Now the Ords are helping us, and we are with them.
Yeah, so you want to jump in, but real quick, Sergey, before, he's going to get a two-finger, and I'm going to go to Cliff. But I just want to ask you, I mean, this will be a selfish question on my part, folks, but we just had elections in America, and I remember interviewing you here on this stage where you said democracy was going into the drain and into the gutter, and that it would take. What do you think about the January, not January 6th, but the election that we just had?
It's absolutely obviously democracy is one of the ways to manage human complex societies. It is one of the worst. Probably even the tyranny, is probably Hitler type or something. It's probably worse. But the next will be democracy. It's anti-meritocracy, badly managed, and the only reason why we say that democracy is better, it's the famous saying by Churchill, but read Churchill better. On every other line, he's against democracy, but this line was taken from him and put on somewhere on the motors which have been fooling humanity for about 40, 50 years. That's it. Democracy has been done away with many times in history. It will return. It's one of the ways of managing. United States will probably be some kind of a democracy because you were born a society. Brits might be. The rest would be a various mix of autocracy, hopefully monarchies here. And the rest, maybe there will be new ways of organizing and running complex societies.
I just want to note the glee with which you share that. Andrey, you had a two-finger.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that the real choice that Russia has to make, and with which it struggled for many, many, many centuries, is not a choice between the East and the West. It's rather a choice between self-imposed isolationism and integration into a broader international community, because the laws of this community are the same. And I think the problem for the Russian psyche is that quite often the outside world is perceived as inherently hostile, unfriendly, and dangerous. But as a historian, I can remind you that...
And doesn't it look like it's choosing self-imposed isolation now?
Well, I think that for many in Russia today, it's the natural choice, unfortunately. But historically, let me emphasize it, the Russian state emerged as a trading state on the routes between the Varangians and the Greeks. So integration is in our genes. We're not doomed to stay isolated from the rest of the world.
Right. Cliff, Anwar Gargash this morning mentioned some of the countries Sergey Karaganov just mentioned, but he talked about India to Nigeria, Vietnam to Mexico, and I found that fascinating because it's sort of anticipating that these nations will find power and place and significance and consequence down the road, and that's why they're in that. These four nations are very rarely mentioned in Washington, by the way, but I'm just interested as you think about the world we're in, as you think about what I ask about China, and you think about the evolution, do things get better or do they get a whole hell of a lot messier?
Well, I think that we are in a bipolar world where the US and China are the superpowers. I think if you look at any objective aggregate indexes of hard military power and real economic power, you get the US and China, with the US still in the military sphere significantly ahead of China, but then the drop between China and the number 3 country, very stark. And that is how you define bipolarity. To me, that's actually quite clear. So we have a system, I think, where the basic dynamic is a function of these two powers, but Steve, where there's a lot more room for middle powers than there was in the previous period of bipolarity called the Cold War. It's not like that.
Right.
There's a lot more sort of room for middle powers. And I mean, two real points, I think, for this audience. First, the main manifestation to me of bipolarity is the binary decoupling, pulling apart, which is going to happen in the high-tech world. It's happening. Huawei was Exhibit A, the CHIPS Act is Exhibit B, the US is out to kill the Chinese semiconductor industry, and countries like this are going to have to choose sides. Secondly, the entire world is at some point, I think, going to be aligning more or less between these two powers. That will take longer. A few points, if I could, on my colleagues. I think within this world, Russia is a vastly diminished power. I think Russia now has permanently weakened itself, will be under Western sanctions for years. Unless we get an unexpected agreement, these are forever sanctions, kind of like forever stamps. They're just not going to go away. The arms export industry is going to be weakened. Even that, I mean, Russia's going to be a vastly weakened state. It was a competitor in the military sphere for the top rank. Now I think it's dropped. Secondly, I mean, Sergey talks about the rise of the East. Well, we have seen the tremendous power the United States has, for better or for worse, it's a reality, over the global financial system through sanctions. There's this impending tsunami of sanctions that came up against Russia. I mean, that kind of power is not going to go away, and it's very hard to do business in the world if you don't have a MasterCard. That's just reality. It's very hard to clear accounts, without using the US dollar. North-South. Yes, Andrey, I agree with you. The split's going to get very bad. It's going to worsen. But ultimately, to be realpolitik about it, what can the South do? Where's the South's leverage? I grapple with that. I grapple whether there is a so what to the worsening of the North-South split. Okay, and the final point I wanted to make is that in this region, given U.S. retrenchment, I totally agree with Sergey, the U.S. is retrenching, will structurally retrench. Democrats, Republicans, Trump or no Trump. This region, I think, has become increasingly unmoored, despite what the distinguished guest at the beginning said, from the United States.
Say that one more time, I couldn't hear.
I think this region has already become unmoored from the United States. I think that the OPEC Plus decision to infuriate the Biden administration was the first incipient sound of a Saudi-first policy, of an Emirati-first policy, of a new age in which this country and this region are going to make their own decisions based mainly on commercial interests first. Secondly, I think in this bipolar world, the big winner over the medium term in this region is clearly China. Already a rising economic power, a huge energy consumer. China will be playing an increasing economic role. And throughout history, we see that when great powers start to play economic roles, they're backfilled with security roles because those powers have an interest in the stability of the region. So I think China is the rising power in this region, for really interesting structural reasons.
Fascinating. Let me ask both of our Russian colleagues here how they view the Middle East, North Africa region as a very provocative statement that it become unmoored to a certain degree from a reliance on the U.S. And I find it fascinating because Iran is still out there and perceived as a threat. I find it fascinating because one day Iraq will be back, and we saw what happened in the 1990s, and there seems to be amnesia about that moment of great insecurity in the region and how it happened. But how do you, to a certain degree, again, with the perception of American contraction, Russia became involved in Libya, Russia began to become more involved in Egypt, often, with support of other regional players here. Does Russia have aspirations of being a far more core force in this region as it has become unmoored from America? Andrey?
Well, first of all, let me say that I agree that the United States starts downplaying the region in the system of its foreign policy priorities. And the credibility of U.S. security guarantees to the region can be questioned. However, there is no alternative. There is no benign regional hegemonic power which would be able to replace the United States as the security provider. Most of the powers which are security providers are outside of the region, or at least outside of the Arab world. We can talk about Iran, we can talk about Turkey.
And you don't see Russia becoming that?
No, I don't think that Russia can or is willing to replace the United States as the main security provider. It doesn't have resources, it doesn't have the interests, it doesn't have the intentions to do so. However, I think Russia will be present in the region as a major player, especially in places where it is already now. I think Syria will be there to stay. Russia will preserve its special relations with Iran, but it will try to balance these relations by building stronger ties to Gulf states, that's clear. And I think that Russia will probably try to cooperate with China so that the level of their coordination on the MENA region will increase in future. Something like joint naval exercises or solidarity voting in the United Nations, or maybe even joint assistance packages in Syria, elsewhere. Afghanistan is definitely a country to watch where Russian-China partnership might be put to a test. But I think that Russia will be ready and willing to work with China as well as with the regional players in order to make sure that the US contraction will not lead to chaos and disruption in the region.
Sergey?
I think that Russia will continue to play a role of a balancer of, modest security provider, all the more that its present role is extremely profitable. I mean, our role in our situation, our presence in Syria, helped our Persian Gulf friends, has provided us with an avalanche of monies, by the way, because of our ability to help to manage the oil prices and to help to keep things under control. So Russia will be here, but as an outside, and God forbids we are not willing to fill the vacuum. It's like putting, Americans have burned their hands, and retreating, why should we? I think the Chinese will be not coming as a geopolitical power, but they will be everywhere here. A lot of things, but we have been talking here in traditional terms, but we should think in historic terms. Almost everything, if not a lot, will depend on Arab states and the Persian Gulf states themselves. Of course, some of the Arab states would be partly destabilized, food prices, etc. But the key problem from my point of view, and I applaud the efforts of United Arab Emirates, is to build bridges with the Persians, with Iran. If things are stabilized there, this will be one of the powerhouses of the world. And the provider of stability, stability, wealth, etc., etc. But they have to solve the problem. A few years ago, it was absolutely impossible to even to predict that Israel's will be all over. But United Arab Emirates and their friends in the Persian Gulf did that. Why not solving the Iranian problem? All the more that the Iranian problem is partially artificial, because of Iran was put in this strange position because Americans could not forget the humiliation of 1979, I think, yeah?
Right.
Yes. But now when the United States are gradually, with their destabilizing policies, are gradually moving away, hopefully not fully because it's a major power. The local people could take things into their hand, and we see that they are ready. They're becoming more independent, more sovereign, and I am happy about that. The world is becoming freer, more responsible, and this is a very good development. We have contributed to that as Russia by undermining the foundation Western dominance in the world, and that is military predominance, which allowed them to rob all the world, I mean, for 500 years. Now they are free.
Sergey, I want to, you know, the rumor about you is whether or not you talk to Vladimir Putin all the time or not, and I don't know whether people do, that people think that you think like him, and that he thinks like you, and so that the way you process things is similar, and so people look at you as a proxy for the way Vladimir Putin looks at things. Now, this may be untrue, but let's just pretend it is. Let's just pretend it is. I want to acknowledge that in the room we have the Ukrainian ambassador, and I want to be careful as we talk about off-ramps that we acknowledge that it's always important to remember other parties in the room that are very part of this. But I'm interested in what Vladimir Putin would consider as a potential off-ramp or a way to deal with the Ukrainian situation, which has become so high cost for Russia, certainly high cost for Ukraine, it's high cost for the West, whether or not you have any thoughts about that. And I want to acknowledge that Ukrainian friends of mine have said, not 1 inch, this is the wrong time to discuss that. But given what Cliff Kupchan shared with General Mark Milley, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, certain members of Congress are calling for some opportunity for diplomacy to come in to begin looking at that. Just put all those parties there. But what does Vladimir Putin think would be the
First
way
of all,
forward?
I never talked to Vladimir Putin. It used to, but now, no. So if we think, I mean, in parallel, I'm
okay, well, what does Sergey Karaganov think?
Safe.
Yeah.
So I could talk only on my behalf. My thing, I believe that we will continue this conflict until we get some positive results. The positive results is a kind of political solution with parts of Ukraine going under control of Russia, parts of Ukraine fully demilitarized and fully neutral, which we offered. If Donbass is secure and etc., if things go exacerbate on the military level, I mean, we shall simply wipe away, and that's the worst scenario for the Ukrainian people. And of course, many people in Russia believe that Ukraine should not cease to exist as a state because it is creating itself as an anti-Russian entity. I hope that wouldn't happen because Ukraine has been a burden on Soviet neck, the biggest burden for several decades. I don't want to put that burden again on our shoulders. And also running, I mean, a devastated, robbed country with completely devastated elites and completely corrupt elites. One of the worst scenarios. I was joking many years that if Americans want to really harm Russia, it should present Ukraine wrapped in a nice paper to Russia so that it would have an indigestion. That was public, so
it's an interesting provocation. Andrey Kortunov, nobody would accuse you of being aligned with Putin's thinking, but how do you see it?
Well, first of all, let me say that we got closest to some kind of a settlement in Istanbul in the end of March, where they almost agreed on a package of some compromises, which turned out to be more or less acceptable to both sides. Unfortunately, these conversations were interrupted, and arguably it is impossible to get back to where we were in the end of March. Too much blood has been spilled, and too many changes on the ground have happened since then. So my take is that the best scenario we could probably count on is a ceasefire. Again, it will not happen tomorrow. I think both sides believe that time might make the negotiating positions better. So unfortunately, I envisage another cycle of escalation. I hope that it will not be a protracted cycle of escalation and that both sides will deplete their resources and their commitment to continue fighting, maybe by the end of year, maybe next year. And then the question would be how to make this ceasefire as stable as possible, more stable than the Minsk II agreements. I think it would partially depend on the international engagement in terms of monitoring. I personally do not believe that OSCE can provide an adequate monitoring mission given the length of the line of contact. We will definitely need something extra, maybe a hybrid UN/OSCE mission, something like that. And then gradually we can get back to territorial issues, because definitely we cannot address them today, but we can address them when the dust settles. And I hope that even these issues can be resolved, especially if we are thinking about new political cycles in Russia, in Ukraine, and also in the West.
Cliff, I'm going to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we don't have questions because of the microphones are having difficulty, as I understand it. But I want to ask you to respond to that same question, because you mentioned General Milley's views and you talked about needing to get to a certain point. But in that process, how do you, I think the American experience, and whether or not you think this is a defining issue for the United States, that does it look like appeasement or abandonment of Ukrainians who, to Andrey Kortunov's point, responded, fairly, incredibly valiantly, if you want to call it, incredibly strongly with regard to this invasion, in a way that we had anticipated or said that the Afghans would in light of Afghanistan. So, when you kind of look at Afghanistan, no resilience. You look at Ukraine, I think a lot of people did not expect Ukraine to do as well as it did. And it has created equities for the West, equities for the United States and NATO that really matter for a non-ally nation that was, was flirting with membership in NATO. But how do we extract ourselves from this in a way, or how do we get to an outcome that's acceptable, because the United States has made it a defining challenge for itself?
Well, first, Steve, I want to thank you for starting the rumor that Sergey talks to Vladimir Putin frequently. It's one that I will repeat for the rest of the week. I think it's really, no, look, Putin's losing the war. I mean, there's a fundamental reality here. He's just plain losing. And I think he knows that. I mean, we've all been around him a good bit. He's a really, really smart guy. There's no two ways to look at that. He's losing ground. His army doesn't want to fight. He's having trouble mobilizing people. He's got increasing problems in Moscow. He's losing the war. That, to me, look, to answer your question directly, the Ukrainians will make their own decision as to what's okay and what's not okay. Washington won't. And I've spoken to enough of our guys, who I've known my whole life, to know that's what they will do in this. We're not going to be forcing things on Mr. Zelensky. That said, I also believe that Mr. Zelensky is a very smart guy. He knows kind of what's possible broadly, and I think what's not. He knows how many of his kids are dying every day. I think he's well aware of that. I think this is a time for flexibility. And I hope that on some level, Sergey and the Russians, people like Sergey, are more flexible than what we just heard, because I think that would be needed. One of the things that, my final sort of plea to this audience, though, is that, look, my view is not very popular at home. What I just said up here, I'm sure I'll hear about it when I fly home. It's a very minority view. It's one I think is absolutely right. But so too do I ask people in the audience, Emiratis, if there's a role to play. This country and the Saudis can play a very important role in mediating. And I think the next 3 months or so, it probably won't work. Look, this time next year, this war will probably go on for a decade. But it might not. And we all got to play the chance that it might not. And so that I hope the Emirati government will remain involved. and we'll work, you know, with other governments in the region, the Turks possibly. There's a group of countries that can make a difference here, that have positioned themselves really well. And that's going to be a really important part of possibly, hopefully, getting us out of this mess before too many more people die.
Well, thank you for that. Let me just say, and finally, you know, my view of this is that informed by lots of folks, and I want to thank all of you for your candor, and I want to tell our audience, this is emotional. This is psychologically traumatic in many ways to think about the fact that tomorrow is not going to be defined by the way we did things yesterday. That said, you know, change sometimes comes very quickly, sometimes change comes very slowly. I'm reminded that Clifford Kupchan has a wonderful brother, a good friend of mine, who served in the Obama White House as the National Security Director in the National Security Council for Europe and Russia, and he wrote a book 20 years ago called The End of the American Era. You can buy it on Amazon. But the book was right, but came too early, perhaps, or maybe not. My friend Jacob Habron and others, we were in a conversation recently, we're talking about maybe if America is in strategic contraction, everyone else is in faster contraction. So America's doing well on a relative basis compared to many other states. And so it is a changing system, and this is an edgy conversation that I think was very, very important, and that I think we will need to continue. So I'll tell Ebtisam that 15 years from now, I think the world will be, in fact, different. Maybe part of that conversation started here today with what will happen, and sometimes it's nasty and brutal. Lives are lost. We need to remember how to get back out of that with some, I think, dignity and respect for mankind in a way, and begin thinking about what the deficits were that got us into the horrible mess we're in. So I want to thank very much Dr. Sergey Karaganov, Clifford Kupchan, and Andrey Kortunov. Thank you very much.